Nobody can do it black. All right. All right. Thank you, Ms. Juanita, for the musical selection in place of Mr. Thomas today. Welcome to Sarah Stevenson's Tuesday Forum, where our guest today is caught up in something that I know very well about. That is traffic after daycare drop-off. So she will be here shortly. But while we wait for our guest, Mrs. Carrie Cook, that's a maiden name, I believe, but we'll figure out the rest when she gets here. But Miss Carrie Cook is our guest today, but in the meantime, we will just take care of the housekeeping. Let me stand up, be respectful. My name is Winston Robinson. I am a facilitator along with co-facilitators, Ms. Laura Cleddy, Ms. Carlenia Ivory, Ms. Jackie Edwards-Walton, Ms. Nathalie McElrath, Ms. Mary Johnson, our website editor, Steve Johnston, Mr. Steve Johnston, and our chaplain, Ms. Aretha Sherrill. Our forum begins at 8:30 a.m. and concludes at 9:45 a.m., at which time we will pause for announcements from the audience. Announcements also can be sent to Steve at sjohnston, with a T, at tuesdayforumcharlotte.org. We always begin with a prayer from our chaplain, so please, Ms. Aretha, if you would indulge us with a morning prayer.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Let us bow our heads in prayer, please. God, we're so thankful this morning for all the beauty that surrounds us. We're thankful for our children. We're thankful for clear air. We're thankful for the sunshine. We're thankful for the rain. We're thankful for the sky streaked with all the colors of the rainbows. We're thankful for the knowledge that nature speaks to us this way and expands our knowledge. God, remember our children this morning everywhere, all the time. Bless them. Remember our nation. Remember those in our United States who make decisions for us, who criticize those decision makers and discuss and aspire to be and replace them. Remember us, the forum, in prayer. Remember our county, our community, and our homes. It's in Jesus Christ's Son's name that we pray. Let us say together, amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Ms. Aretha. Walking in the door right now, the superstar, the woman of the hour. All right. So, do we have anyone with us for the first time? I don't believe so. All right. She's not even. Okay. Okay. You want to introduce yourself since you're coming back? We would love to just hear from you.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Edwards. I'm a Star Guidance Counselor
Yeah.
from Nash County. Glad to be here.
Welcome down east. I like it. Welcome to Tuesday Morning Forum. So following the presentation from our presenter, we will take questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order in which your hand was raised. Questions should be questions and questions should be no longer than 30 seconds. Right now, I always like to take this time to have a moment for silence. That's when we just take a little bit of time to be intentional about putting our phones on silent. Don't be the one. Make sure your phones are on silent. And I'm going to try to kill a little more time so Kiera can not feel like she's rushed. Are you ready to go? Huh?
Listen, mamas, this is your
Listen,
morning. When
I told them, look, I got one that turned 1 last week, so I know about that life. I was actually late myself, just not as late. But with no further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please, Miss Carrie Cook of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond.
Perfect. Thank you, Winston. I appreciate the opportunity. Do I need the mic or can you? Yes. Okay. Steve said yes, emphatically. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this morning. As he mentioned, I'm Carrie Cook. I have the privilege of leading our community development work with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And so the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond includes North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. And so I have to start with my disclaimer, which the views expressed here are my own. They are not those of the Fed or the Richmond Fed or the Federal Reserve System. My other disclaimer is that we had thunderstorms last night and my baby wanted to come back in the room at 1 o'clock, at 3 o'clock, at 5 o'clock. So, I am going to do my best here this morning, but I ask for a little bit of grace as I may need to refer to my notes. And I'm going to power up on my green juice and we're going to get through this. And if you have questions as we go through the deck, please let me know. But it's a privilege to be here. I mean, many of you are friends and have been friends for years, so I consider it all joy that we're still here, that we're still asking the questions, that we're still thinking about what's in the best interest of our communities. And I'm a Charlotte native, so I'm someone who grew up here and had the opportunity to attend Dorada Elementary and Ranson Middle School and Vance, now Chambers High School. And Charlotte is just always going to be home to me no matter where I am. And so I'm just, again, really thrilled to be here with you this morning. So we're going to jump into the deck, and then I'm going to leave majority of the time for questions as we come to the end. But I want to jump into the information because many people see what's happening in our economy, right? And many people see the FOMC cycles that happen every 6 to 8 weeks, which is the Federal Open Markets Committee, who is the interest rate setting body, right? So people are familiar with that side of the Fed and when the interest rates go up, right? When your auto loans get higher, when your home loans get higher, when money gets more expensive to borrow. So people are familiar with that side of the Fed, but people are generally a little bit less familiar with the community development side of the Fed. And it is, in fact, by legislative mandate, one of the 5 core functions of the Federal Reserve System. And so the Federal Reserve System, as I alluded to, has 5 core functions, right? What are those functions? The first is to conduct the nation's monetary policy. And so I just talked about the tool that is at our disposal, really to look at supporting maximum employment, stable prices, and long-term moderate interest rates, right? And there's a 2% Fed funds target rate, and right now we're not quite there. We're higher than we were. But what I will say is that the days of, I think the past couple of years have been an anomaly, right? The days of home loans at 2%, at 3%, of auto loans at some of those low rates. The reason the Fed is continuing to raise rates is in an attempt for the second piece there, which is around price stabilization. Because the goal is to reduce demand somewhat so that prices can stabilize and more people can afford to live in the communities where they choose to live, work, and play. So the second goal is to promote the stability of the financial system, right, and to maximize and contain system risk. The third goal is to promote the safety and soundness of individual financial institutions. So the Fed is a regulator, right? There are 3 regulators in our country. It's the Federal Reserve Bank, it's the OCC, Office of Comptroller of Currency, and it's the FDIC. And so those 3 sister agencies are regulators for individual banks. Just by maybe if 1 or 2 people will call out, is there a bank that you use that's a regional or national bank? Regional banks? What's the bank?
BBT, oh, it's
Truist. Okay, yep, and Truist.
Wells Fargo would be national.
and Wells Fargo. So the Fed, depending on how a bank sets up their charter, depends on which three of those bodies oversees them and make sure they are doing the work that they are supposed to be doing from a safety and soundness perspective, but also from a community reinvestment perspective. So I'll talk some more about that in number 5. But number 4, we foster the payment and settlement system to make sure that anytime you're sending money, how many people have sent money on their phone and sent money in other means, right? So just making sure that financial transactions are going through and settled in a safe and efficient manner. And then the 5th thing is to promote consumer protection and community development, which is really where I'm gonna focus today. Because again, that's the less well-known side of the Fed, and community development is my passion, and is the work I'm really excited and proud to lead at the Fed. So the Board of Governors of the Fed really demonstrates that the community development function is to promote economic growth and financial mobility for low and moderate income communities and individuals by partnering with stakeholders like you, community leaders, conducting research, and convening different community partners. And so really the undergirding, or the reason why the community development function exists at the Federal Reserve Bank, is to meet the requirements of CRA. And the Community Reinvestment Act is legislation that was put into place in 1977, right as you were coming through pieces of legislation that really sought to address many of the inequitable lending and inequitable practices that were happening across the country. And so in order to help meet the credit and capital needs of communities where banks do business, especially low and moderate income communities, the Community Reinvestment Act was put into place. So basically CRA says, hey, banks, you have a requirement and an obligation to lend in low and moderate income communities. And why is that? Again, Congress enacted this piece of legislation in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's really about addressing systemic discrimination and people's access to capital and credit. And so we know that many times Black folks, folks of a certain religion, folks in certain neighborhoods were excluded from the ability to purchase homes, right? They were excluded from the ability to get capital and credit for a variety of reasons. And so because of that exclusion and what was called redlining, where you see literally the government and banks had red maps of areas where it was deemed more risky to do lending in communities. And so I'm not going to go through so much of that particular topic, but it really is important to start off with, because this is why CRA exists today. It's why the legislation is currently being modernized for the first time in 30 years. So the Community Reinvestment Act right now is going through a series of edits and updates in Congress, and a new rule will come out this year in terms of what happens with the Community Reinvestment Act and how communities and banks should be able to access financial services and loans based upon the new rule. So this is just a little bit of history before we get started. And then we're going to go into the system strategic goals for community development, as well as our own Richmond Fed community development goals for our bank. So the system strategic goals are really around enhancing the public's understanding and then focusing on 3 sort of cross-cutting factors. And when you think about those cross-cutting factors and you think about the ways in which we operate, one of them for the 2022-2023 plan is around access to capital and credit. One of them is around financial inclusion, and one of them is around racial equity. So I think for the first time, the Federal Reserve said we have to be doing more work to that end. And that leads into the community development of Richmond, the community development team at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and how we have structured our body of work. So we support the bank's mission by advancing economic resilience and mobility in LMI communities in 3 ways. What are those 3 things? We conduct and share research. I'll give you some examples of our research in just a minute and the types of research we do. It's around barriers to economic opportunity and promising practices that will support communities, around things like, when you think about barriers to the Fed's mandate, which our mandate is maximum employment, right? When you think about barriers to folks being able to get into the workforce and advance in the workforce, things like housing, things like transportation, things like benefits cliff. All of these are issues to people being able to advance in the workforce, and I'll give you some examples of this in just a minute. The second thing we do is partner for action. So I'll give you a very specific example also in just a moment of one particular investment collaborative that we're rolling out in partnership with banks, with community organizations, with CDFIs, with other people who provide capital to support investment in low and moderate income communities. So a very specific program where we're partnering for action. And then the third thing is to support capital access. So again, going back to CRA, we're encouraging our communities to better understand capital access and absorption in the district, and encouraging banks to meet the capital and credit needs of people in the district. So we catalyze change in communities through research, actionable insights, and partnerships. Again, those are the three things. This is just taking something from out of my brain and putting it on a slide in terms of how we do the work. It's just helpful for me to see the how and what goes into the system. So the Fed is engaging and partnering in communities. We're conducting research. And then there's a network of strategic partners, of which many of you in the room are the folks that we're looking to work with, right? Community leaders, public and private sector leaders, nonprofit partners. And so that works in alignment to improve systems so that the systems have new resources, new partners, and new ideas. And that leads to a more healthy, inclusive, and sustainable economy. So focus on people and places, the 5th district. When you think about the Carolinas, of course there is a rich history in the South, but there's also, as we know, challenges to be overcome economically, especially when you think about small towns and rural communities. So the bank has really done a lot of work to lean into that. But this is just to note that this is going to be a slide that gives you an opportunity to look at the share of residents across the 5th district. Again, the 5th district is North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. This is the share of residents who are low and moderate income as defined by the federal poverty guidelines, right? And so in the census tract data. And so this breaks it up. The brown shades, for those of you who it may be harder to see, the brown shades are the shades of urban. The greenish bluish shades are the shades of rural. So it just shows you where there's a deeper concentration of people and places that are low and moderate income across the 5th district. And just to give you a greater perspective on that, when you look at urban across the 5th district, 30% approximately would be considered low to moderate income. I mean, when we're talking about low to moderate income, a lot of times folks think we're talking about a very small slither of the community. But in fact, we're talking about nearly a third of folks who are living in communities across the 5th district that are low to moderate income. If you break that down and slice the data even further, you're talking about for rural communities, which are defined in rural codes, those communities which have a certain population, the number of LMI communities goes to 43%. So nearly half of the people in communities that are rural and small town across the 5th district are low and moderate income. And so really, when you talk about the number of people living under 200% below the federal poverty line, it's persistently higher in rural areas than in urban areas, but we know that urban areas still face their share of challenges in supporting economic mobility and financial inclusion. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those things and the work that we're doing around those things. If we break it down just a step further, this is the share of population of people living below 200% of the federal poverty line. So just for contrast, the previous slide included low and moderate income. This slide only includes low income as defined by 200% or below of the federal poverty line. And so the numbers come up a little bit. You're talking more about 1/4% of the population versus 35 to 43%, but still 1/4% to be low income across our district is a significant number of people. And oftentimes when you hear sound bites and clips and people talking about low income, there is a stigma or a perception that this is 3 or 4 or 5%. This is some very small percent of people. No, we're talking about a significant number of the family members, the friends, the neighbors that we have in communities across the 5th district. So I'm going to keep moving unless there are any specific questions on this so far. And what I'll share in the next slide is as we look at, yes.
I do have a specific question in that regard. Wicked end?
Yep. So we have form rules that she's going to do her well, our presenters get through their presentation, then we take hands by, so we got you on the list though.
Yeah.
All right, we got you on the list.
Okay, perfect. So keep those questions tallied up so that we make sure we get to them when we are to the end of the presentation here. But a focus on people and places is where we are going to talk about for just a minute. So here you see the breakdown of the U.S. is at the top. Again, I know some of you can see it, some of you may not be able to see it, so I'm just going to talk through it. So the first slide, the first row that you see is the United States. And that's the urban and rural breakdown in the United States. And that is the percentage of people over 65. That is the percentage of people with bachelor's degree or higher. The employment to population ratio, and EPOP is another means of how people define things like economic mobility and healthy vitality of a community. The next column you see is labor force participation rate, so those who are participating who are able between the ages 16 to 64. And then you have the percent below the poverty line as well as the percent of the population. So for us, and for the context here, oftentimes when I'm sharing, I may be sharing with groups who have people across the entire 5th District, but what we'll focus on is the 4th row from the bottom, which is North Carolina. So in North Carolina, when you look at urban and rural, when you look at the percent 65 plus, 14% urban, 18.5% rural. When you look at the percent with a bachelor's degree or higher, urban 36%, rural 20%. When you look at the employment to population ratio, urban 67%, rural 64%, and you can see the remainder of the numbers there through the rest of the row. The last thing I'll say is that urban and rural, when you look at North Carolina, there's where you see a real stark difference. Urban 66%, rural 34%. And the reason I share that is also because, again, our bank has decided to lean in and focus more on what's happening in small towns. And it's not to the exclusion of urban, because we understand there are a lot of things that need to happen, a lot of work that needs to happen around financial inclusion and around economic mobility with low and moderate income communities and urban communities. But also, when you see the disparate outcomes that you see in each of these categories, we understand there's a lot more work to promote maximum employment and healthy economies in rural areas and small towns. So what are our Richmond Fed community development priorities? A couple of things. The first is access to capital and credit. That is really driven by our core mandate and what we do as a result of the Community Reinvestment Act. So making sure that capital and credit can flow to low and moderate income communities. The second is supporting and promoting economic mobility via labor market participation and addressing the opportunities and the barriers around that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and give some examples. And the third is really increasing our focus on smaller towns and rural areas. And part of that is a byproduct of things, areas like Charlotte that continue to expand. As that expansion happens, folks who have been here for generations, when you talk about affordability and you talk about the ability to stay in this community, many times folks are now choosing to move to smaller towns and rural areas. Some of them feel like it's not by choice, it's by, I can't afford to live in an area like Charlotte anymore. But subsequently, some of the outer rungs of smaller towns and rural areas across the 5th District and across the country are growing. Some of them are losing population, but some of them who are surrounded by metro areas like Charlotte are growing. And so things like housing, transportation, food, healthcare, all of those things become really important to a healthy economy. And especially because, again, we rely upon, the Charlotte market relies upon workers who are coming from surrounding areas. It's not just people who live in Charlotte, right? It's people who live in a number of different areas around the city. And so when we talk about capital and credit, just very specifically, I talked about CRA already, and that legislation is being modernized right now for the first time in 3 decades. And it's to look at how money goes into low and moderate income communities from financial institutions via their CRA obligation. The second is a program we have called Investment Connection, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The third is CDFIs. How many people in this room are familiar with CDFIs? Okay, 1, 2. Okay, all right. Well, we're gonna learn today, as Kevin Hart said. We're gonna get some lessons. So, Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFI. And so CDFIs are really Treasury certified lenders that are designed to do business in under-resourced communities. So think about a traditional bank. They have a mandate and a mission, and they have to follow a certain set of guidelines. CDFIs really set themselves up as mission-driven lenders. So they operate in communities across the 5th District, and they operate in a way that profit isn't their bottom line, supporting communities, coaching businesses, coaching entrepreneurs, providing the capital access after people have built their enterprise into a way that it is ready to grow. CDFIs are a high-touch model. They do a lot more work in communities to prepare them for the finances and the financial inclusion, and they're an important and growing group of institutions in our country. They really came out of the 70s. Not a lot of CDFIs existed. Over the last couple of years, that number over the last decade, the number of CDFIs in our country has nearly doubled. And so when you look at now, there are approximately 1,500 CDFIs in the country. We have just a small number of CDFIs that are here in Charlotte, but it's important to understand about these institutions, especially because CDFIs tend to be counter-cyclical in terms of the lending cycle. So when capital and credit gets tighter at traditional banks and in the traditional marketplace, oftentimes people are going to CDFIs to try to get that capital and credit to grow. So for example, the economic conditions we're in right now, where interest rates are going up a little bit, right? And interest rates have been moving to try to stabilize prices and try to get our economy on a strong footing. What you're seeing is that CDFIs are experiencing an increase in demand. More people are going to them, trying to get capital from them to grow their enterprise or to make the numbers work, because CDFIs also don't have the same underwriting standards as a traditional bank. Now, they still have to operate in a safe and sound manner, but they have more flexibility and creativity in the way they're able to provide capital to communities. So oftentimes entrepreneurs, particularly you think about minority, Black and brown entrepreneurs, they're looking for innovative ways to finance projects. It may be bringing a community center, and they're looking for someone to support the capital stack, and they've got a certain, it may take $5 million, they're short $1 million, and a CDFI may come in and look at that and say, we can provide the other $1 million needed to make that center happen because we can be more innovative in how we provide our capital. So CDFIs are a really important piece of the financial structure and financial marketplace in our country, and they're not as well known, again, because they're still emerging as an industry, but they provide critical capital and credit to communities. And then the Small Business Credit Survey is another thing that we do, the CDFI survey. So what we've just done over the last 3 months, we put together a CDFI survey to understand what's happening with CDFIs, because there's not a lot of information about how they're functioning, what the demand is, who's using them, why they're using them, what kind of capital and credit challenges they're meeting and supporting in communities. So we've just closed a survey over the last 3 months, and I mentioned to you there are 1,500 CDFIs in the country. In the 5th District, of course, there's a smaller slice of that because we're just a piece of the country. But of the 1,500 CDFIs, we were able to get almost 500 to take the survey. So we're going to have a very good sample size to give data around what's happening with this industry and how they're meeting capital and credit needs of low-income communities. Particularly in the pandemic, y'all, CDFIs became clutch. CDFIs really were a go-to to disperse. You had capital coming out from all kinds of different sources and federal agencies. You had capital coming out for the CARES Act, for PPP, for this thing, for that thing, for ESSA funds, for all of these different federal programs. And they needed to find trusted lenders in the community who could get those dollars out the door to places where those dollars were needed. And CDFIs were really critical in doing that. And as a result, actually, the Senate, the U.S. Senate Community Development Finance Caucus is a new caucus that just formed. It's a bipartisan caucus in Congress, which is important to note because these days, trying to get something together with different people is not the easiest thing. It's a bipartisan caucus that is focused on community community development finance and things like CDFIs and how we get things done. So this bipartisan group of senators has come together to say, how do we advance meeting the capital and credit needs of low and moderate income communities, which is a huge opportunity. Hopefully the CDFI survey that I just talked to you about, they asked me to come and brief those members of the CDFI Senate caucus a couple of months ago, and I told them, we're getting ready to do our survey, here's what we know so far, but once our survey is complete, I'll be able to have new data to come back and share with you and update with you what's going on with communities and with CDFIs. So the second way in which we're approaching this is labor market participation, right? Because the Fed's mandate, the primary mandate, is around maximum employment. And the ways in which we do this, benefits cliff, early care and education work, y'all, so many people are still struggling with work because of care issues, whether they are caring for elders or whether they're caring for our little people, right? Our youngest in society. And so when you think about the impact that childcare and the care economy has had on folks' ability to work and fully participate in the job market, it's significant. We saw that millions of women left the workforce as a result of the pandemic. And now slowly the numbers women are coming back and entering the workforce. But what I can tell you from a major project that we did called the Worker Voices Project is that fundamentally how people want and need to work has shifted over the last couple of years. How and where and why people are showing up in the workplace has fundamentally changed. And I'll talk about our Worker Voices Project in just a second, but it is the first time that we as a Federal Reserve Bank have directly asked workers what their experiences were, right? We did a series of focus groups around the country and said, hey, what are the barriers to you getting back into the workforce? What are the opportunities for you? How do we make sure that if you're on the sidelines right now for one reason or another, whether it be childcare, whether it be I'm not going to get a COVID shot, whether it be I don't have transportation, whatever the issue may be, how do we understand more about that? And then how do we put forward solutions? How do we work with other folks who are in the policy sector or practitioners or industry, corporate? How do we work to put together solutions to get people into the workplace and into the job market? Economic education is another thing that we really focus on to make sure folks understand what's happening in the world of economics and are educated in that way, and that we can produce, I mean, y'all, the number of economists, and this is a group that is focused on the issues in the Black community. So what I'll share is that the number of economists in our country, Black economists in our country, is 1%. It is just a small slither of folks who are doing the work of economics and economics data. And so if we can educate kids starting in grade school about the economy and economics and understanding what's happening, hopefully we can put more of a pipeline of folks together who are interested in this as a career opportunity, right? The number of PhD Black economists, 1 to 2%. It's slim. And so that's another opportunity for us to build a pipeline and support more broad access to economic education, and then K-12 and post-secondary research. So small town and rural, what are we doing here? Again, I talked some about why we're focusing more on small towns and rural communities, not to the exclusion of urban, but leaning more into this because in the chart that I showed you all earlier, you see more disparate outcomes in rural communities and small towns. A higher percentage of people who don't have education, a higher percentage of people formalized education, a higher percentage of people who are not working and not in the workforce, a higher percentage of people who are low and moderate income, right? And so for all of those reasons, it's important to understand more of that and what are the barriers and challenges around racial and spatial disparities. What are the barriers and challenges around capital investment and absorption in rural communities and small towns? And then what's happening around things like, even in this day and age, we are spending a significant amount of time working with communities that are more rural around digital access. It's something that many of us take for granted, right? That I've got this laptop right here, ready to pull up, show my deck, go through this slide. Many of our rural communities and small towns in the 5th District today still are not connected And if they are connected, they are not connected in a high-speed way that allows them to access financial services, that allows them to access the job market, that allows them to access childcare, that allows them to access the things they need to survive as a household. But we don't want folks to just survive. We want them to be able to thrive economically in the communities where they already are. We don't want to have to say, well, you have to move here to thrive. People should be able to thrive where they are. And so that's the significance of small town and rural communities and the work that we're doing in partnership there. So a couple of different projects that I'll spotlight. One of the things that I talked with you all about is Investment Connection, and it's a program that introduces public and private funders, so banks and other private funders. It introduces those private funders to proposals from community-based organizations and small businesses that benefit low and moderate income communities. So let's say you are a group of folks here, the forum decided, or there's a subgroup of folks here who run a nonprofit who are looking to build an affordable housing community. And you have a proposal put together, and you want to make sure that that proposal can get funded by a variety of funders. When we have our Investment Connection program, we bring those funders to the table because the step that we take and the reason it's attractive to more funders is that we have our what's called SRC group, Supervision, Regulation, and Credit Bank at the group at the bank, the group responsible for CRA exams of the banks. So the banks have to pass these CRA exams to make sure they're lending in communities. We make sure that those projects are already CRA eligible. So as a bank, it's taking some of the guesswork out of, if I put money into this project, is it going to help me meet my CRA obligation? We say, let us review the projects, we'll take a look at them, and then we'll bring together those project proposals with funders. And we don't guarantee, we're not a funder. The Fed is not a funder. So we don't say we're going to provide any money. We don't say there's going to be a guarantee of any match. But we're providing the connection opportunity. We're providing a platform to say, if you have a project, come and pitch your project, share your project, and let multiple funders hear it and figure out if it meets sort of what they're trying to fund and what it is that they're interested in, and let's see if there can be a funding match. We held one recently in partnership with a couple of folks, and it was focused specifically on CDFIs. We held it at Howard University because Dr. Frederick, who is the outgoing, he's getting ready to retire as president of Howard, but phenomenal leader, and we partnered with him since he's one of our board members. And we held an Investment Connection there. And folks talked about everything from microloans for Black and brown entrepreneurs, and that being something they were trying to fund, to affordable housing, to technology improvements for their small business. So if you have a project or a proposal and you want it to be funded, Investment Connection is a great opportunity and a great platform for that. And so we continue to do those across the district so that we can benefit and support the capital and credit needs of communities. The second thing that I'll talk about, how many people are familiar with Benefits Cliff? Okay, 2, 3, okay, all right, we're learning a lot of good stuff. Then we're gonna walk away with lots of new information that we'll be able to share with other community members. So Benefits Cliff, essentially, or what's referred to as the cliff effect, is essentially a hurdle where when you have an sort of an increase in your earnings, let's take a very real example. You have someone who is earning $12 an hour. They get an opportunity from their job to get another $2 an hour, to go to $14 an hour. It sounds like, yeah, you're gonna pay me more, I will take the promotion, I will take the additional funds, and I will be able to do more with my household wallet, right? Well, the challenge is that $2 an hour increase may push them over the benefits cliff, which is why it's called Benefits Cliff. So the benefits that they were receiving, maybe that $2 an hour, they're now losing $8,000 a year in a child care benefit because they have gotten over the threshold of income to qualify for that benefit anymore. So in reality, they should be incentivized to move up economically, right? And they should say this is going to be a great opportunity, but workers across the country are experiencing this effect and turning down promotions, turning down opportunities to earn more because financially it will result in a net decrease in resources for their family. And so when you think about that type of effect, and when you think about somebody saying, I can't afford to lose a $10,000 sort of allocation for childcare, or I can't afford to no longer have this SNAP benefit, or I can't afford to no longer have this. So I think the goal here has been to understand more about the cliff effect and to figure out how to inform policymakers to change the way the cliff distribution happens, right? So instead of you losing the whole $8,000 child care subsidy, is there a graduated reduction in benefits that would support you to keep advancing economically and still have the support you need to do that, right? Until you can phase all the way out of needing it. But this is a huge issue that we continue to hear about. And it's one of the issues that is not, as people know it's an issue, they don't know the formality of the name benefits cliff. And so we're trying to socialize that and help more people understand that benefits cliff is a real issue. Families and individuals lose some or all of their economic supports in certain cases when they are looking at labor market increased opportunities. And what can we do about that? What can we do about that? So that is one thing I wanted to highlight. I just spoke last week, a Charlotte Business Journal reporter reached out because he was writing a story about the benefits cliff, which I was very, very happy to hear. I mean, for more and more people should be talking about this. And the challenge also is that when you think about benefits cliff, benefits are administered differently state to state. So there may be some things that can happen at the federal policy level, but also what needs to happen differently within different states. And are there lessons? Are there things we can, like, I was reading an article last week about the Massachusetts legislature that just put in some funding and some policy changes around benefits cliff in their state, right? And so, like, what are the lessons that we can take from other areas? And then are there federal things that we should be doing to understand how to support incentivizing workers in the workplace instead of disincentivizing them to move up? So the one more thing that I talked about earlier was the Worker Voices Project. And so the reason we did the Worker Voices Project was because workers' voices are missing from policy. Oftentimes we're talking with intermediaries, we're talking with CEOs, we're talking with the heads of nonprofit or community-based organizations, but we're not talking directly with workers themselves. And so in these focus groups that we held across the country, the Federal Reserve System worked with a third-party vendor, and we set up groups, and not only set up these groups, but one of the important things that I think should be a part of the action part and the research part of working with communities is recognize people that are experts in their own lives, right, and experts in their own experience. So not only did we ask them to participate in the focus group, we said, all right, here is a stipend for participating because your time is valuable. And so provided that stipend, had them participate, had them share with us and talk to us about their experiences within the workforce between 2020 and 2022. And this was a certain population. So we were looking for folks who had certain criteria around their workforce experience, their education experience, et cetera. But at the end of the day, again, what we heard is fundamentally how people want and need to work has shifted. And I think one of the biggest words that resonated with many of us as we went through the survey was dignity. People want dignity in their work. And so that was a big takeaway. And people are really willing to, maybe I will take a different job that it may pay different, or my hours may be different, or something about this is different because of the way it works for me and my family. More people are opting in to that. And so we're hearing that and we're seeing that and trying to understand the impact of that on the labor market. So we're at the end of the presentation, and I hope this has been the time that was allocated. I hope I've managed the time well. But hopefully you walk away with understanding more about community development at the Fed, how we are supporting capital access, how we are improving opportunities for low and moderate income communities around financial inclusion, our overall mandate around price stabilization and maximum employment, and how all of these things tie together, because we've got to do a better job of helping people understand the Fed as a whole, and how we can partner with communities. I will end by saying I never expected, and I didn't have on my little vision board to go be an executive at the Fed. That wasn't a part of my life's dreams. And life will take you to different places, and this is, working for a U.S. Senator, working in grassroots community organizing, working for nonprofits, working to support business growth. Those are all things in my past, and they have really prepared me to show up in this way, in this role, in a way that's a privilege and in a way that's a huge opportunity to leverage the past experiences and to leverage the team and the relationships to do some meaningful and impactful work in communities across the 5th District and across the country. So I'll end there, and I will say, here are some questions that I'm curious about hearing from you. So as you ask your questions, I'm also asking you some questions, and I would love for you to touch on one or a couple of these in our Q&A period. And the questions include economic and community development trends that are happening that may not be showing up in the data yet. So what's happening? What's happening in real time? Because we know that data lags, right? Like, by the time you collect the data and analyze the data and put something out, put a report out, something totally different is happening in communities, right? And so what's happening on the ground right now that we should be aware of? How have costs impacted your workforce? Are you or your business experiencing capital credit tightening? How are households and communities responding to higher prices of essential items like food, housing, transportation? And are you seeing spending adjustments? And then lastly, just more generally, what are the most prominent economic concerns of your community at the moment? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ms. Cook. We have questions. So absolutely. Round of applause. We're going to get into our questions, and the first question comes from Mr. Gary Young.
He's not allowed to ask a question.
Shout out former advanced athletes.
Yes.
State champion basketball player brought home the title.
Well, the mic isn't There we go. I gotta get the Winston microphone. Ms. Cook, as the Fed is a unique bank compared to our traditional national and regional banks, does the Fed have a supply chain for suppliers and supply diversity team working to introduce minority and women-owned businesses for capital opportunities to do work with the bank?
It's a great question, Gary, and it's something that I've only been at the Fed for a year, so I'm still learning a lot. But one of the things I will say is that in my 3rd month on the job, I asked this question. I was like, how are we including businesses in our own? Like, we are a big entity. We're a big business. We do a lot of contracts. We do a lot of work. What percent of that is with minority businesses? How are we supporting small businesses? How are we supporting diverse businesses? And so I was pointed in the direction of our minority and women-owned department at the Fed. So we do very intentionally have a team of folks who is working on this. And the next thing that I did was attend and speak at an event in Philadelphia, which its goal was supplier diversity. And its goal was, if anybody has a business that is interested in doing business with the Fed, come to this conference, learn more about the opportunities, what the needs are, where the contracts are, where there are open sort of bids like actively happening. And so it was great to be there in partnership at the Philly Fed to see all the small business owners who were there saying, yes, I would like to do business either with the Fed or just learn more about doing business with more people, right? And getting greater contracts, because oftentimes, I think when it comes to minority businesses, the catch-22 is like, well, that business is not big enough. Well, how does that business get big enough to get the bigger contract if they don't have the next opportunity? And so it really was great to see that we are being intentional about this. What I'll also say is that we have developed what's called a community of practice, which is about 2 dozen, don't quote me on the number, companies in the Richmond area. We're starting with Richmond since that's where our bank is headquartered, even though we serve these 6 states. We're starting there, and there is a community of practice saying, okay, it's some of the largest companies in that area, and it's some small businesses working together to identify what are the barriers, what are the challenges, how do they create more supplier diversity opportunities. Really a community of practice is intended to share information, share knowledge, share best practices. So what are we seeing around the country that we could learn and implement, and also how do we make sure some of those things happen? And Gary, you'll probably remember this, but back maybe a decade ago, the Charlotte Chamber had CMEDI, the Charlotte Minority Economic Development Initiative. And so I lifted that up as an example to say, if we're trying to get more big businesses to provide contracts with small businesses so that they can grow their business size and scale as well, then here's an example, and there are also several other examples across the country that we can learn from. And so that was great. So it's a work in progress. We're setting up communities of practice to learn and to make sure that's happening as a bank. We have a department that's committed and focused on it as a bank. And it's just one of those things that I was pleasantly surprised to learn about all the efforts that are happening. So if you're interested, I can provide you with the link specifically around if you're interested in doing business with the Fed. I can provide you with that information.
All right, Carrie, we have a question from one of our internet viewers, Faith Triggs. Her question is, how, when, and who founded the Federal Reserve, and is it part of the federal government or a private institution?
That's a great question. So the Fed has been around for quite some time. I don't want to mess up the exact date. I should know the exact date, but I'm sure I can find it for you in my notes before we go. But one of the things that I would love to clear up is oftentimes people think the Fed is a federal government agency, and we're not. We're an independent agency that was set up by Congress, right? And so we're an independent agency that is, we serve at the pleasure of Congress. So Congress could change something about the Fed if they had the votes. They could, again, we're beholden to the legislative mandate in Congress that set up the Fed, but we are an independent agency. So we're not a federal government agency like HUD or DHHS or Department of Transportation, some of the other federal government agencies that are out there. We are an independent agency, and part of that independence, again, is by design, because you don't want the influence, especially as a regulator. Remember, one of our core functions is a regulator to provide oversight for banks, so that independence is critical in that regulation function.
Hi, Carrie. I think you have the best job in the world, and I think you're the best person for it.
Thanks,
So
Ross.
I appreciated the data that you presented, urban, rural. I'm wondering if the Fed, and I'm assuming it does, disaggregates that data by race and gender, urban and rural, how that influences your community engagement and your practices around economic mobility.
Yeah, that is a great question, Roz. One of the questions I asked coming in was, how do we get better data? Because part of what we see, and in some instances, right, the Fed is not, we are relying on the data that's already out there. We're not collecting the data. In some instances, we are collecting the data, like the CDFI survey. And other instances, like the chart, I'll go back to it, the chart that you saw here, this is ACS data, so the American Community Survey. So this is like census, ACS data that we're pulling together to give an example, but it's not our own like data set, right? And so one of the things that we're pushing those who are collecting data on, especially when it comes to census tract, is better. So you can see it by county here, but what would it look like to better track it by neighborhood or by other specifics and slices and cuts of the data to understand what's happening and what's going on? And so some of the challenges around what are the data capacities and capabilities of organizations, especially those who are pulling together data that's informing policymakers and practitioners, where you need those critical little sort of subsets to disaggregate what's happening. I mean, because just because a county is LMI, you could have significant outliers in that county that are skewing it. Or you could have a county where you have a significant portion of people who are low to moderate income, but you have, you know, this outlier group that is extremely wealthy, and that could be skewing it up higher, right? And so you got to think about how you can slice and cut the data and what that tells you. And that's why, Roz, I'm really excited about this CDFI survey, because I think, you know, we've had the survey the last couple of years. Asking different questions this time is gonna allow us to analyze and have a perspective in different ways. So analyzing it by rural and urban, understanding racial demographics, understanding geographic sort of demographics, understanding even when you think about by type of business or type of segment that they're supporting. Like if you're a CDFI that's just focused on housing, or if you're a CDFI that's just focused on lending to small businesses. So we'll be able to really cut that in interesting ways and understand more about it, but that's because it's our own data set. So I do think part of it is pushing folks who are collecting data to be able to cut it in different ways, to tell different stories that are true about what's happening on the ground.
So it's on me. I have a question, Carrie, and it's kind of in that same neighborhood of what you just answered. I wanted to know, and this question is based on just seeing how our state legislature is and how we govern, as well as my own familial experience. My family is from Kershaw County, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, while we take and know the numbers for the poverty levels, how are we assessing quality of life? $40,000 in Charlotte and $40,000 annually in Kershaw County are two completely different experiences. So how do we utilize not only just more of a human approach to data to kind of get results that would provide more equitable outcomes instead of just looking at strict numbers?
That's such a good question, Winston. And it's a part of what's happening right now. And we just wrote a paper and put it on our website, which I'm happy to follow up with this link. Just wrote a paper about affordability, because that's really what you're asking. What can people afford based on what they make where they are, right? Because that affordability is different in Charlotte. Like you said, 40 stacks in Charlotte is different than in Kershaw, right? And in other cities across the district. And so when you think about affordability, when you think about housing costs, food costs, transportation costs, even the proximity to things, because proximity can change costs, right? So if you're in a more rural area and it takes you 30 minutes to get to the closest source of healthy food, what is the cost? Not only financially, but what are the other challenges that are associated with that? And so I think I'll share the work we just did on trying to understand affordability, and two, the other thing I'll say is that some affordability measures are defined differently depending on which group you're talking to. But one affordability measure that I'm interested in looking more at is one that United Way recently developed called ALICE. Is anybody else familiar with ALICE? So asset limited income, now I'm forgetting the C and the E, but essentially it is a measure, I have to pull it up, but essentially it is a measure of looking at what you can afford in asset limited income constrained. Yes, and so it is looking at what you can afford based on where you are, right? It's looking at how people manage to live where they are and where they work. And so there are part of the reason I mention Alice is because part of the challenge is that folks say some of these measures don't accurately capture affordability. Some of the existing measures don't accurately address people being able to afford the prices as they stand, right? And so are there new measures that should exist? Are there other ways of defining, even should the federal poverty guidelines? I was at a policy conference in Cleveland last week, and there were a couple of people who were really championing re-looking at the federal poverty guidelines and looking at that. So I think they're essentially, what you're talking about is affordability. We've written a lot of pieces and papers on this that I can share some links to, and it's something we have to continue to study and continue to figure out, how do we qualify what's affordable for what community.
Thank you. Now we have Garcia in the back.
Thank you so much for being here today. The information that you're sharing is unbelievable and definitely needed in our communities. My name is Garcia Nelson, president of an organization called BUB Great, nonprofit here, based in Charlotte, executive director for the MEN organization, stand for Mentoring, Educating, and Nurturing. You answered, I had three questions, but you answered it, and so I want to combine this one question. Wake Forest had given us about $40 million about 13 years ago to do a research in regards to e-cigarettes here in Mecklenburg County. We had 14 counties. We had a certain time frame to gather a certain number of teams and to spend the money and to ensure that the data that was being collected was turned in an effective manner. With what you're looking to do in the rural area and small towns, I'm hoping that if it's possible, can nonprofit organizations such as ours that will and are able to go out into these rural areas to do data collecting and research to help with trainings, seminars, classes that are needed, partnering with health departments, sheriff offices, and local schools to have these forums to be provided at these locations. And if that's something that we can partner with to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, Garcia. So the short answer is absolutely we are looking for partners because the longer play and what we're working on in small town and rural communities, there's sort of two tracks that I'm hearing as we're out in communities. One, and this relates to rural capital investment. One is short term and one is long term. So when we think about rural capital investment and what's needed, put on the economic side, let's think about it from supply and demand. So supply, how do we help align the supply of capital that's needed in rural communities? And that's going to mean CDFIs, banks, private sector funders, public sector funders, et cetera. How do we help align and bring those capital providers into one place? On the demand side, how do we help communities frame up investable opportunities for that capital to flow into? Because part of the challenge that you hear is, well, we would invest in rural communities, but the project is not investable yet. It's an idea, it's a thought, the community knows it needs a new center, or it needs a new water sewer infrastructure, or it needs a downtown revitalization. It needs something, but it may be, especially, I'm from, anybody familiar with Warrenton, North Carolina? Okay, so I'm from Warren County. So when you think about what's happening in smaller towns and communities, my family resides and hails from, and many still live in Warren County, and oftentimes you got people who are wearing multiple hats. You got a person who's the community leader, who's the pastor, who's the economic developer. I mean, people are wearing multiple hats. And so to be able to your point, Garcia, the reason I mentioned the supply and demand side is because to help frame up these investable opportunities, to provide the demand of projects that the capital can then fund, we're going to have to increase capacity. And we're going to have to support communities in a way that says you may be capacity limited, or you may be resource limited, or you need more skills, or you need all of the above. And who can we partner with to support that? And so what we're doing now is building out what's called a Rural Investment Collaborative. And so the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond is working on this Rural Investment Collaborative. It's a brand new initiative. This is probably one of the first groups I'm talking with about it. And this Rural Investment Collaborative is going to allow us to encourage communities from across the 5th District to participate in what's called an investment framework training. So how do they get training to frame up their investable opportunities? But also we're going to need partners to facilitate the training, different parts of the training, who have expertise and knowledge in different parts of how you frame up an investable project, how you work with a nonprofit to develop the project, how you work with other community leaders. So I am giving you a long-winded answer because we are doing a lot of work on this right now and trying to set the groundwork for this. Last week we had I don't know, Steve, it's still green, but it's hello. Okay. Last week we had 2 weeks ago we had folks who represent national and regional foundations at our Fed in Charlotte, the Charlotte branch, which is right down the street, and we had them come together to talk about what would it look like if they put their philanthropic capital into this. Right, because if you put your philanthropic capital into this, if we get banks to put some of their efforts into this and their capital into this, if we get, there are 400 federal funding streams for small towns and rural tribes. Like, helping communities to just navigate what funding stream is right for me for this project that I'm trying to do, and then making the funding stream accessible to them. Just because it's available doesn't mean it's accessible. So, I mean, there is so much that's tied up into this and trying to support rural capital investment and support what's happening in rural communities and small towns, that absolutely we're going to need partners to do this work and build out this rural investment collaborative. But I gave you that sort of long-winded answer because there is a lot of work happening on this. And we recognize, back to the original point I made, there are two tracks. There's the short-term track of helping communities make these investments and partnering with communities and intermediaries and nonprofits and the capital stack and others to do it. The longer term track is, do you need all of these 400 federal funding streams, or should this be like collapsed in a way that there are maybe less streams, but it's easier to access? Or there are, like, how do we make sure that over the long time, the system that you have to navigate to access capital is easier for communities to navigate?
All right. Check. One. All right. In consideration of time, we're going to ask that you limit your questions to 30 seconds. And please, Carrie, if you could limit your answers to a minute.
Okay.
All right, Ms. Juanita.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. You had an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Juanita Miller. And with regard to the nonprofits that you alluded to in your presentation, in fact, I have two nonprofits, Crime Victims Coalition and the South Mecklenburg High School National Alumni Association that I founded, both of those. So when you mentioned the investment connections, how does one contact those investment connections? And you mentioned also the CDFIs that you all survey those. So we would like to know, I'm sure you would be a good source for us to go through those ones that you have vetted. And we'd like to know more what they're looking for. Thank you.
It's two good questions. So I'll give two quick answers to follow the prompt here. So on the on the CDFIs, we have a whole page on our Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond website devoted to CDFIs and our work and our partnership and engagement with them. I'll make sure I include a link to that site so that you can learn about CDFIs in the district and the ones in which we are continuing to work with, so you can kind of figure out what's the best track for you. On the former question, your groups, on the former question, CDFIs, the first question was investment connection, sorry, I blanked. On investment connection, there is also a link to our investment connection site, and so we actually have another investment connection in North Carolina that's going to be coming up later this year, so I can provide a link to that site. You can understand more about it. But the thing about investment connection that's also good is that once you submit a project for investment connection, it stays on that portal. Sorry, she's telling me it's time. It stays on that portal, and banks can continue to look at it even after that pitch session. So there's still an opportunity to receive capital even if it doesn't happen that day.
Thank you, Ms. McClellan.
Okay, my question is about the old rule and the new rules. You've spoken about those earlier. Can you give us an example of a couple of old rules and a couple of the new rules that are in effect now? You had mentioned that earlier.
For the Community Reinvestment Act?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the Community Reinvestment Act, I can't give you a full answer to that only because the final rule is not out yet. And so what's happening right now is, just to give you try to put a lot of information in a quick amount of time. Over the last year or two, there was an announcement of the public rule change, which is called an ANPR. So that went to the public to say, what do you want to see in the new rule? There was a public comment period for about a year. People in the community were able to comment, banks were able to comment, community-based organizations all commented, and now the policymakers are working to analyze and bring together all of those comments in a new proposed final rule. The new rule is supposed to be out later this year. They haven't given an exact date yet, but there's a new rule, and that new rule is intended to do several things, which I can help summarize in a follow-up, but I can help give you all a few examples of the way it will help banks to meet the capital and credit needs of the places and spaces where they do business.
All right, Ms. Walker.
Carrie, I came out of the Community Development Corporation
Yes.
era, funded by CRA back in the 90s here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we worked on quite a few things. But can you speak to some of the new CDFIs that we have here? Just those right here in the Mecklenburg County area, and many of those have tentacles, I know, in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And speak somewhat to the new way that some folk are doing this banking online that's a little different than your traditional banks, or even to the Venmo, Zelle, and Cash App.
It sounds like two different questions. So some of the
I was trying to get in.
some of the new CDFIs, like I'll give you one example that I just connected with their group recently, Aspire Community Capital. Is anybody familiar with Aspire? So a relatively new CDFI in the Charlotte market. And actually, when you think about a place like Charlotte, you would think, because of the financial center that we are, that we're oversaturated with CDFIs, but in fact we're not. There are not a ton of CDFIs here in Charlotte, and so organizations like Aspire, who are working to get capital and credit access in underserved, in low and moderate income, in under-resourced communities, are helping to meet a critical need that's here in our community, because they don't. Many of the services, again, that CDFIs provide are high touch. So part of what Aspire does, and what I was connecting with them on, was their graduation ceremony for people who had gone through, small business owners who had gone through their program, because they want them to help get the capital, but in order to get that capital, many of those small business owners needed to put different things in place for their business to be ready to receive that capital. So it was great to see them come through that program, get their processes in place, and be ready to be further capitalized as a business and grow their business and hire more people. So that was great. On the Zelle, Venmo, Cash App, that's a totally different frame. We don't have a lot to do with those marketplaces, and I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but what I will say is that the Fed is working on ways to support more efficient, safe, and sound processing of electronic movements of money, right?
You know the question. What is that stuff? All right, we're gonna see.
I'll make this very quick. The Federal Reserve here in Charlotte used to allow nonprofit organizations space in the building. Can you get that information? We may be interested in having some type of satellite office there, and then we know we cannot afford these other areas if they still got those opportunities.
It's a great question. We can't provide a satellite office because of some of the rules. I have asked a lot of questions in my first year about what we can and can't do. However, if you want to have an event or a function and it's related to what the Fed does, if it's related to community reinvestment or access to capital or maximum employment price stabilization, we welcome. I want the Fed to be a place where we have space in our office. We welcome groups to have roundtables, to have discussions, to have convenings, to have meetings like this. We want to be able to be a partner where you can come in and advance the discussion, and our team can be a part of that.
Mr. Ken Coons.
I'm sorry I'm late, but there's a lot of road construction going on that you don't know about until you get trapped in the traffic. But I wasn't worried because I know this young lady is going to do her job and do it well. Not here this morning is Tommy Robinson, who always asks the question in regards to when do y'all ask the people what they want? And I remember President Biden saying, someone asked, what do you have to do to get people back into the workforce? And he made a very, in my view, very political answer. He said, pay them more. But what he didn't talk about was if you pay them more, now you're at the benefits cliff. So my question to you is, how extensive has it been in that research you did in terms of people's answers about why they didn't, or they're out of prevents them from getting to the workforce? How many of them have said, not just the money, but the benefits when we get into that benefits cliff?
You hit the nail on the head. It's not just, it's about the total compensation package. And when you're talking with workers about how and why they want to work and what's going on, it's not, the money is important. I don't want to understate that. The money is important and the what they will be able to put in their pockets, but all of the other ancillary benefits. And so employers are thinking differently about childcare. And we're seeing examples around the 5th district of employer-sponsored childcare because they're saying, look, we're not gonna, there's so many things that are challenging here, or the local childcare for our workers is 45 minutes away. We're gonna create our own employer-sponsored childcare right here on our facility. And we saw a really good example of that with United Way of Southwest Virginia, which they put together a coalition of corporations around employer-sponsored childcare and have figured out lots of solutions for thousands of people in their region around childcare. And so that is one great example. But when you talk about the overall benefits, whether it be that people need to access that workplace and that the bus or the public transportation doesn't get them there, can the employer figure out a way to make that a part of the benefit? Can they put some type of commuting stipend towards it, right? So people can afford to be where they live and still get to that place, and still it doesn't eat up their entire income trying to get to work. Like if it eats up your entire income just trying to get to the job, then you're disincentivized again around what needs to happen. So the total benefits around supporting full employment are really critical.
All right, we're going to close it out with the last 3 questions. Michelle, Tanya, and Red, and then we're going to go quickly into announcements because we're pressed for time.
My name is Carrie Nelson.
Oh, I'm sorry, Carrie. I thought it was Michelle's question. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
She was
No
pointing
problem. So it's very encouraging to hear that the Fed is looking at all the underlying issues for full employment and people having affordable lifestyles. So that's great. Quick question about the CDFIs. Where does their capital come from to lend?
It's a great question. Their capital primarily comes from the larger financial institutions, which is interesting, right? Because in some cases it can be a catch-22. But what happens, what you see happen in many cases is that CDFIs are almost a no-brainer eligibility kind of opportunity for CRA, because 9 times out of 10, if you're putting your money in a CFI, it's CRA eligible. So for some financial institutions, as opposed to going out into the community and finding a variety of projects that equal up to what they would put into the community that year, let's say it's $20 million, they may instead decide, I'm going to put that $20 million into these two CDFIs. I'm going to give this CDFI $10 million and this CDFI $10 million, and they let the CDFI go out and do the work of figuring out how to distribute it into low and moderate income communities. So in some instances, you'll hear people criticize that model because it's like, hey, the bank is just hitting the easy button and giving the money to the CDFI. But in some instances, people say it's a model that works because then the CDFI gets to go out and figure out how to make sure those funds get deployed into the community as a mission-driven lender, opposed to a lender that's not necessarily their focus, and now they're trying to, kind of figure out how to distribute those funds.
Tanya?
Hey, Carrie, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned a couple of times about influencing policymakers, so I was curious about exactly what does the Fed do specifically in North Carolina when it comes to influencing? Is it advocacy, influencing? How does that work?
Yeah, a lot of times, and I'll use influence in a way that is, I'll be cautious about it because the Fed system as a whole has probably a different risk tolerance than some of the regional reserve banks, right? There are 12 regional reserve banks. The Richmond Fed, we're the 5th district. We're the 5th of 12. And so it depends a lot about the risk tolerance of that bank and the leadership of that bank and what that bank is willing to put out in terms of research and articles and information. And so certainly there are things as a system we do to inform policymakers as if the Fed writes a paper, you know, and people are going to try to understand it and try to figure out what happens with it. But in terms of the 5th district, when we are putting out something, there is so much process that goes into, like, what are we saying, how are we saying it, why are we saying it, and who are we trying to inform or influence, right? So I think to answer your question, Tanya, it's we're looking at, is this a policy that would need to be changed at the state level, or is this something that would need to be changed at the federal level? What is the data that we're gathering? What are all the facts? And I think we've moved from a bank that would just put facts out there and say, that's it, here are the facts, you decide what you want to do with it, to a bank that is now saying, here are the facts, and here are some recommendations, right? So that looks different than just here are the facts. And so we're trying to be more deliberate about putting out, like, things that will support communities, especially related to our mission and our mandate. But it's still a tight wall.
All right, Ray, go ahead and close us out. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time. Are there any meetings that the community can be involved in that has answers? Because I hear a lot of questions, but I like to speak answers. But us as a community, when and where can the community sit down at the table of the infrastructure and the feds to be able to discuss what we need to know and also walk alongside this journey? Because one thing being a business owner, our policies and procedures are creating us in a form that is outdated per se, where it's not realistic for the ground floor workers. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Ray. And I think I appreciate what you said about the ground floor workers. I think that's why it was so key that last year we did this Worker Voices project, because it is about listening directly to workers. And another forum that the Board of Governors and that the Federal Reserve Bank has taken on over the last couple of years is called Fed Listens. And so we had one last week in Cleveland. And so it was a forum for people to be in a room just like this. And the vice chair of our Federal Reserve Board was there along with others. And it wasn't for them to talk. It was just for them to listen. And so people stood up and asked their questions and talked about everything from child care to benefits cliff. They put recommendations out there. They talked about housing, and it's an opportunity for the Fed just to sit back and say, let us listen and understand what's happening. We are, I believe, looking at a Fed Listens later this year in North Carolina, so I'm happy to continue, again, to point people to links on our site that would do that kind of forum. But also, the other thing that I was meeting with the Smithville community in Cornelius recently, and what they're trying to do is pretty amazing there. If you don't know about what's happening with one of the oldest Black communities in Smithville, right down the road, I'd encourage you to understand more about what's happening. But Smithville, when I was meeting with them and talking with some of their leadership, I said, you know, as a next step, you all and others should come into the bank, and we should have a conversation about capital access and how you fund some of these projects and how you are more innovative, how we can get capital providers to be more innovative on funding these projects.
With that said, we'd like to thank Ms. Carrie Cook for this dynamic and very informative presentation. If you have questions, you got time to hang around, I guess, for a second?
Yeah.
But that will conclude our forum. We have, if you have a short announcement within 15 seconds. I take that as a no. But I do want to say, oh man, come on, Garcia.
Real short announcement, www.bybg.org. You can contact us. We have merchandise we're selling. We're looking to try to raise about $50,000. We need the community help and support because of what we do in the community. We need your help.
Thank you.
www.bybg.org.
And I do want to take the liberty to shout out one of our previous speakers, Jamise Ivy of the United Way. We talk a lot about accountability in this forum, and she put her money where her mouth is. She came in here and dropped these application packets off, literally 75, 100 pages of things that are, you know, of course, in today's world, are all online. She printed them out for this forum because that is what we requested. She didn't stay to talk. She didn't stay. She just dropped them off, did her job, and left. So that is what we need. That is what we look for. Shout out to both Jamise and the United Way for such a show of accountability. And thank you for attending today's Tuesday morning Sarah Stevenson Tuesday Forum. We will see you next week with another amazing guest. No, 4th of July. 4th of July. Don't come here. Don't come here. The week after, though.